to episode 6 now of the StackCast. Today we are speaking with Amaury Sechet
Mhm.
and Joey King of eCash. How about you, Amaury, introduce yourself, and then we'll have Joey introduce himself right after that.
Yeah, so I'm Amaury Sechet. I've been in the whole crypto thing since late 2010, roughly like November or December, like late in the year. So it's been a little bit more than 10 years by now. I've been involved pretty seriously, let's say, starting 2016 or so, in project about scaling Bitcoins, that ended up leading to the creation of Bitcoin Cash. And nowadays I'm working on eCash, which have similar, like the idea behind it are similar to Bitcoin Cash, but I think there are serious execution problem with Bitcoin Cash. So we're working on eCash. That's the high level story.
And I'm Joey King. I've been involved in crypto since 2013. I came in as kind of a non-technical guy. I'm an engineer, but I was involved in construction project management, and I started getting into software really as a way to work in crypto full time. So I started being a full-time developer in crypto in 2015, and I've been developing sort of through all of the drama between Bitcoin and Bitcoin forking to Bitcoin Cash, and then now we're on eCash. So just as crypto is, I'd say, an empirically iterating technology, I've been sort of following that with my career and how I use my time and what we're trying to work on.
So you went to school for engineering.
Oh yeah, I'm a mechanical engineer.
Okay,
So I mean, you
interesting.
do some programming there, but yeah, you definitely
And
don't do
so on the programming
Bitcoin stuff.
side, are you self-taught then?
Yeah, I mean, I technically like, yeah, you do programming, and being an engineer certainly helps if you want to like get into crypto and do development like that. But yeah, I'd say the first two coding jobs I had, the people should not have hired me. But you definitely learn while you're on the job. And now, like, I'm a more senior developer. Like, I'll have guys working for me, or I'll work with other developers, and I sort of realize now, like, it wasn't a terrible idea for those guys to hire me. It's actually quite difficult to find really just people who can follow instructions and understand things and get into it. So, like, if you're looking to get into crypto development or be self-taught, you really shouldn't be discouraged. The bar is not as high as it seems. Once you actually get into it and pay attention, like if you're doing those things, you're going to be way, way above 80% of people who are trying to do this stuff. So it's not impossible.
No, yeah, and I wanted to add, you pretty much have to be self-taught to some extent to work in that industry. Like, to begin with, when I did my study, I have an engineering degree in networking myself, network and telecommunication. So it's a bit more, closer to the software industry, but not quite. I'm not like technically a software engineer, but I probably did much more software than you did, Joey, during my studies. But nevertheless, anything that has to do with cryptocurrencies, you are going to have like, server, client, application, this kind of stuff. You're going to have distributed system and consensus algorithm. You're going to have cryptography. And you're going to be hard pressed to find an actual cursus that's going to give you like a very strong formation in all those aspects in like, the few years that it takes to get an engineering degree. So if you really want to work in that industry, there are going to be part of it that you don't know and that you're going to have to learn by yourself. It's pretty much a given. No, that doesn't mean that it's unworkable. And like, to the contrary, if you have self-motivation and stuff like that, it's probably an industry that is easier to get into than other industry that are gonna have a license, kind of,
Right.
There is no barrier to entry other than you're gonna have to have the motivation to learn something new.
Yeah, and to get through the discouragement of a lot of crypto stuff is not as easily Googleable as computer programming memes suggest. I'd say for other stuff, like you're not going to find the answers to exact problems just served up to you. So you will have to like test things and iterate through.
I believe that. I've tried to look up plenty of things just to help my own kind of basic level of understanding of different concepts, and even that can be the results can be very lacking. So I'm sure
Yeah,
there's
Yeah, I
hard
think
curve there.
for two reasons mostly. One of them is because many projects are pushing the boundaries of, like what is being done, like pushing the state of the art forward. So by definition, you're not going to get a lot of material, but also because it's money at the end of the day, or at least there is a monetary aspect to it, uh, people can be very motivated in their reasoning, right? And so finding the right information that is, technically objective is sometimes difficult because of that.
Yeah, there is no technically objective information in crypto, it seems. Like even stuff that
There
should be,
is, but yeah.
it might be related to how one protocol works, but preferring that protocol over another is already a political decision. And it's like, oh, okay, that's the best way to solve the problem. And it's,
Well, if you don't mind me switching directions too much, how about we just jump right into it? We're here mainly to cover eCash, although I do like hearing a little bit more about the personal side of these things as well. But for anyone who's not familiar with eCash at all, how about we get like just a quick pitch here?
sure. So like to go off what we were just talking about cryptocurrency, and in many ways it seems like a very new industry if you try to just find information at a technical level online. And part of that is because it's always empirically iterating, and all the decisions are somewhat political, and all of the preferences are kind of win or lose in terms of at least how many traders think about it, right? They think if you're using their project instead of your project, then maybe like they'll make more money. So maybe they want you to buy this instead of that, or use this instead of that. And there's this whole sort of political dimension to what's going to happen and why. That totally was over my head in 2013. And now, like in 2013, I feel like the crypto motivation and how everything's happening is very much like separation of money and state. There's some clear financial problems. We can use technology to solve some of those problems. Here's the solution. We're going to remove some of the social problems that exist in money by making it technologically objective. Now, over the last 10 years or more, what's happened is that money is a social phenomena, and there's been lots of political controversies that have crept up in cryptocurrency in terms of what's the optimal way to solve these monetary problems. We've had lots of different opinions about it. 2017, notably, there was the entire whole scaling debate, and you had Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, which now it doesn't really seem like a big deal, but at the time, like that was what dominated all of the bull market moves. Now you have the whole UTXO based coins versus account based coins with the rise of Ethereum and all of the would-be ETH killers that came up in 2020. And that itself has its own sort of scaling debate and different money and different economies of scale and different incentives. And eCash came out of the most recent bull market. So it was more of Bitcoin Cash was losing momentum. It wasn't remaining competitive in top cryptocurrencies. And it importantly wasn't able to attract talented open source developers to keep building the technology. So in terms of funding, most of the Bitcoin Cash development team did not want it to have any funding, and some people did. There are a lot of arguments, and eventually said, you know what, it's permissionless, we're just going to fork, and eCash came out of that. Since that happened, eCash has continued on the roadmap of Bitcoin Cash, implementing Avalanche, which is a more improved consensus algorithm on top of proof of work. But in general, what we're doing is still what we thought we were trying to do with Bitcoin in 2013. We've just had to iterate to overcome some of those social problems that have come up in the meantime.
And to get into this a little more specifically, why do you believe that Bitcoin Cash was maybe not staying as competitive, as you put it? What do you feel like needed to be improved upon in that sense?
Social problems. That's it. And that's the hardest thing about crypto, right? Like you get into it and you're a developer and you think, oh, how am I going to solve these basically math problems, and especially with limited documentation, or maybe you're trying something new. But money is a social phenomenon, and cryptocurrencies, always the biggest problem you're going to have to solve is a social problem. So you'll have paths taken by projects like Bitcoin, I would say, is an example, or Ethereum. I think Bitcoin has some of the best developer talent in crypto, especially on UTXO-based chains. But I would say its social approach has been very market-driven and market focused to the point where Bitcoin development decisions, I think, started as kind of a Ouija board of what can we do to get the highest price. And now it's kind of backed into a corner that there's almost nothing that they can do in general to solve other monetary social problems. The whole approach of Bitcoin Cash was basically to take a riskier technical approach, scaling on chain. I say risky, like we don't think it's a riskier approach, but in 2017, that was the crux of the debate. And the reason it was portrayed as riskier is because you have this whole like, well, can we scale on chain or can we not? Technically, yes, you can. Socially, it's actually very difficult. And that was what the whole Bitcoin Cash controversy was about. We don't really need to go into all of that history, but basically we say UTXO chain can scale on chain, and we want to do that. BTC wasn't going to go that way, so we went that way with BCH. With BCH, social problems. I'd say the culture produced lots of firebrands who were not necessarily technically advancing the project. And ultimately, the incentives lined up where if you made a lot of noise and you promised things that were great, you would get followers and influence within that internal community. That doesn't work out very well. I'd say if you're trying to build a cryptocurrency, at the time, it didn't seem like it would be so bad. But after that existed for, say, 3 years, it went through its own controversial, totally meaningless forks with BSV coming into existence. A number of zealots on all sides continuing to following different splinter factions, and ultimately not great software. So you had poor app development, you had a lack of consistent talent focusing on the chain, you had poor marketing because the community wouldn't stick up for itself. So right off the gate, right, the ticker changed mainly because Bitfinex didn't like them, and there was nothing to stop it. It was just sort of like rolled with. And then on top of that, if you don't have the actual developers to do the work, you can't pursue the loftier technical goals that eCash has been going for. So for example, BCH today does not have Avalanche consensus and eCash does. And that's basically because we were able to keep and retain the best UTXO developers through our funding model.
Yeah, so I wanted to maybe like bring things a bit, to a higher level. So in the beginning of the scaling wars, there was this discussion like, do we want Bitcoin to be digital cash or electronic cash, or do we want it to be digital gold, right? This was really what the scaling things was about. And the decision that you have to make there are different. Like if you want it to be digital gold, which like is the main vision in BTC right now, it's like you don't want to change any of its attributes. Right? Like no matter what the attributes are, they are what they are, because, you're not going to change the properties of gold. It's just like physically impossible. So if this is the thing that you are trying to emulate, you don't want to change the properties of the system. And this is a direction BTC went into. And it has some upside, right? Because you know that nobody's going to screw it up. Like you buy Bitcoin, in 20 years what you're going to have. The same thing as today, right? On the other hand, we also note that when it comes to the digital cash use, Bitcoin is not so great anymore, and mostly because it's running into scalability problems. And this whole use case has pretty much disappeared. Most people use Bitcoin today through custodials, right? They have their Bitcoins at an exchange or whatever. And even people that use Lightning, for the most part, they have a custodial wallet. They don't have like an actual Lightning node that they're connecting to and whatnot, right? So the problem with that is that, well, there is not really a point to crypto anymore, at least not the point that we were interested in, right? Because if you have to go through custodial and third parties, then I might as well use my bank. It's also a custodial. It does like all kind of custodial stuff, the same kind of stuff that services on Bitcoin would do for me, except like it's better regulated and it has a longer track record of doing things. So like all in all, it seems like this direction is just rebuilding the legacy financial system with like all the details are different, but the general idea are the same. So now the question that, if you want digital cash, then the question you need to ask yourself is, in what way do you want to change Bitcoin so that it's good digital cash? And there are like two main things, but the first one is you want to be scalable, right? If a lot of people start using it, it shouldn't become completely unreliable and very expensive to use. And the second thing is you want the transaction to be pretty much instant, because on Bitcoin, you're gonna have to wait 6 confirmation, which takes about an hour. And know some services, do it a bit faster than that nowadays, but it's still, you cannot go in the shop and pay and get out, right? Because it needs to confirm in a few seconds. So this is what led to the whole reflection, like, how do you achieve that? And Nakamoto consensus by itself does not lead you there. So then, we started looking into Avalanche and we're developing Avalanche. But like, this is really the idea that is behind eCash, is like, you take Bitcoin, or do you make it a good digital cash like we had in 2012 or 2013 or even 2014, right? Like, people were using it as money much more than they do today, actually. So do you get that? And we improve those properties, right? That's the idea behind it from, high level perspective.
And I had actually started to say something a couple of minutes ago and I accidentally muted myself, so sorry about that. But what I was actually meaning to ask you started to get into a little bit, and that was about scalability in particular. What steps has eCash taken to make itself more scalable, perhaps, than Bitcoin or even Bitcoin Cash, etc.?
Yeah, so that's going to be a bit technical if we want to go there. But, like, the first step is going to be increase the block size. But, it's like changing the speed limit on the road, changing the block size. It's not because I put a 1,000 mile per hour speed limit on, the road next by, that suddenly cars are going to be able to drive at that speed, right? That's just, that's the limit of what is possible, but it doesn't mean that the technology follows. So now you need to build a technology that can exploit those bigger block size without it turning into a big problem. And it's really like 1,000 of different stuff, but I can talk about a few bigger one. So one big one is what we call CTOR. So it's a way to organize the transaction in a block, such as the same series of transaction is always going to be in the same order in the block, which means that no, you don't need to, if the node have to exchange a block, they don't need to tell to each other in what order the transaction are in the block. They just have to tell each other what transaction are in the block, and they can deduce the order. And maybe it's a bit counterintuitive, but you actually need to transmit much more information to explain to the other node what order the transactions are in than what the transactions are, right? And that is because all the transactions are exchanged between nodes ahead of time, right? So once you receive a block, you don't actually have to tell the other nodes all the transactions that are in there. You need to tell them, like, okay, you already know all the transactions, which one are included and which one is not. You don't need to transmit the transaction themselves. So because of that, what ended up taking the more bandwidth is actually the ordering. So we just created the canonical ordering, and that problem goes away. Another one is right now in Bitcoin, you have this constraint that the transaction in the block needs to be in topological order. That is very expensive to validate, because that means that you have to validate the transaction one by one effectively. So if you have a large block with a lot of them, that takes a lot of time. What you want to be doing is verify plenty of transactions at the same time in parallel. We have machines with many cores nowadays, so they should be able to do many in parallel. So that's another thing that we did, because we changed the constraints about ordering. We can validate all the transactions in parallel. That's the kind of thing that we do. I don't know what else. There are a few more stuff, but
yeah, you could talk a little bit about what Avalanche does now and where we're going, or I guess I could comment on that. So right now we have Avalanche set up such that we have one block finality. So even Bitcoin today has somewhat of a reversibility within the 6-block time frame, to the point that almost all major exchanges acknowledge it and won't confirm your Bitcoin transaction until you have at least a handful of confirmations. Whereas eCash exchanges today will give us confirmation at 1. So that includes Binance, the biggest one, but also Bitfinex and some of the other legacy players as well. So that's just kind of step one. You know, one confirmation can still be 10 minutes, which is an ideal for the cache use case. It's much better than 1 hour, but it could still be better than that. So the next thing that we're working on in Avalanche is something called pre-consensus. And that basically is the ability for a transaction to have as high of a security confidence as a confirmed transaction before it's actually confirmed. So to be able to get that within seconds instead of minutes would be another cache advantage versus the current model of Bitcoin.
And does that tie into what I keep hearing and seeing about the potential for eCash to have one of the highest transactions per second ever?
Yeah, so it certainly ties into it, but like what Amaury was saying, it's great that we can do that, but again, there's some social things you have to motivate and also some network things you have to solve. So just because we have a very large block size and just because we can support all of that throughput, I think it's wrong to try to design a cryptocurrency to immediately have all those things. And that's kind of the BSV approach, you know? They said, hey, like, look, we've raised the block size by this, and now we're going to fill up all our blocks with weather data and do some other things. And yeah, if that's what you're designing for, like it's like a programmer that's like you wrote a unit test and then you're like, yes, it passed. Okay, great. But like, was it the right test in the first place? So yes, those are all building blocks to getting that level of scalability. But at the same time, I think we need to be realistic about where we're at in the cryptocurrency market, what we need to do to remain competitive, and what we need to do to attract the basically next billion users, you know? In many ways, crypto is old. It's been around for 10 years, and in many ways, it's still very new. You can't just Google how to develop stuff on crypto, and if you just talk to people in the street or try to spend it at a store, they're still going to think you're really, really weird. So we're trying to build the technical foundation so that we can make all of the things we wanted to solve in 2013 technically possible on eCash.
I had to ask about the transaction per second thing because when I was doing a little bit of research, this is something I came up to seeing, over and over and over. It's something people like to talk about a lot.
Yeah,
Even just reviewing eCash in general and their opinions on it is still brought up.
Yeah, so the thing that is really important to understand is more than the throughput is the scalability. So like the question is like, if you have twice as many transactions, can you throw twice the amount of hardware at the problem and be done with it? Or can't you do that, right? And on most protocol, you actually cannot do that. And we remove like all those stuff that cannot be parallelized so that you can actually do that on eCash. But yeah, as Joy mentioned, like you don't want to raise the limit to some crazy amount before there is demand for it, because you end up in the BSV situation where people put a bunch of crap on the chain and now the whole ecosystem collapses because the cost of supporting the chain is so high. It's okay if the cost of supporting the chain is high if you have, you know, really high demand in front of it. But if it's just to, you know, do a lot of transaction there is not a point to it. But yeah, really the important stuff is to remove all the serial steps, such as if you have twice as many transactions, you can throw twice as much hardware at the problem and be done with it. And in that sense, there is almost no ceiling. We know that the project Hamilton, so it's a CDBC project, so it's a bit, you know, unfortunate, but they use similar technique that we use for scalability, and they run tests, and they were able to do like millions of transactions per block without any problem. So like those techniques, they are, you know, they are proven in the sense that we're not the only one using them, and people are getting similar results. Like you can go very, very far in this way.
And are there any privacy or security related implications to something like that?
I mean, to the contrary, like in privacy, you know, there is like how much the information is hidden, and in eCash it's not that hidden, right? Because it's very similar to Bitcoin in that sense. So it's pseudonymous. It's not like completely encrypted, like say a privacy account like Zcash or Monero in that sense. But You also have the notion of what is your privacy set. To take an example, right? Let's say you have a cryptocurrency and it's completely opaque, like cryptographically is super secure. There is no information that leaks whatsoever, but there is just you and your friend that are using it. Well, then I don't need to know the information that are on the chain because I know it's you already, right? So another very important aspect of the privacy that people are neglecting outside of the cryptographic aspect is your anonymity set, meaning like how much people are doing the same stuff. And in that sense, scalability is very important as well, because the more people you have doing stuff, the more you are drawn in the mass of people, if you want, right? And so the less noticeable you are. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we want to have a model similar to Zcash in that way, where you can have part of the system that is transparent and part of the system that is opaque. And why do you want that? Because you want to be able to audit the chain, right? You want to know like how many coins are in circulation, for instance. And when everything is opaque, you cannot do that. And what that means is that the chain that are fully opaque, if there is a bug somewhere in the cryptography, maybe people can print new coins, maybe they do whatever, maybe they can spend coins that are not theirs, maybe they can spend the same coin twice. Like you wouldn't know, right? Because the whole chain is opaque. And actually it's not just a theoretical concern, because a few years ago there was a bug like that in Monero that has been discovered that allowed someone to spend the same coin twice because of some elliptic curve trickery we don't need to get into, but it allowed the same coin to be spent twice. But like when you think about it, it's actually an infinite money cheat, right? Because you have some money, you send it to yourself twice. Now you have twice as much money and you can do it again, right? So each step of the way, you multiply your money by 2 minus fees, right? So in 10 steps, you have done 1,000x your money. And in 20 steps, you have done 1,000,000 times your money. So it's like an infinite money printer, effectively. And the problem with those kind of stuff is that if they happen in any kind of privacy coin situation, you have no way to know. That's the whole point of privacy coin, right? Like the information doesn't leak, it's not visible. So we think that it's a bit of an issue to have the whole system encrypted in that way. And we think the Zcash approach is more sensible in that way, where you can have shielded transaction and non-shielded one. And we have some ideas of how to introduce that without actually changing the protocol, which is nice. Because okay, maybe we want to get into that, but with the Avalanche consensus that we're introducing, we can make what we call subnets. So a subnet is like effectively another chain with different consensus rules, but that is using the same token, and you can move the token back and forth, right? So with that, you can make arbitrary chains that are arbitrary rules. You can make a chain that is completely opaque. You can make a chain that have an EVM. You can make like whatever you want in there. You don't even need to have like the permission or whatever, or like, he can deploy yours, or anyone can make their own. This is all we want to do, like the more opaque privacy stuff, to look back to the original question. In this way, that if something is screwed up in the cryptography, only that subnet is screwed up, right? And the rest of the system remain sound and sane.
Yeah, so it's the technology that eCash has introduced for scaling improves privacy versus coins like Bitcoin. Like the more transactions, the more people get using your chain, the better the data set is, and the more anonymity that is available. But also to Amaury's point, it's very nice to have a platform where privacy is opt-in. There was a whole phase of privacy coins that came up in crypto around 2017, and I think that was sort of the heyday. And I think that they do have, a time and a place, and there's some interesting uses for them, but it makes it a very narrow niche. If you have a platform that can be private, it can be not private. There's a lot of people that don't want privacy for whatever reason. It also makes you a little bit more flexible if you're dealing with regulated exchanges. So we've had less of the issues that some of the privacy-only coins have had, because ultimately privacy on eCash is opt-in.
That is a good point too. And I ask about privacy. Of course, what you're saying definitely makes sense, but there will always be somebody asking if there's some compromise being made, I guess. But
Yeah.
another thing I'll kind of going down that road is cash fusion.
Mm.
Can somebody introduce people to that just a little bit and how that kind of ties into this part of the conversation?
Yeah, so cash fusion is a technology that like it's basically a coin mixer, right? So you can have like several people that put money into cash fusion, and then they're gonna get back the same amount, but the money comes from anywhere, right? And that makes the money very, very difficult to track. And that's something that used to exist on Bitcoin. It still does to some extent, but it doesn't really work on Bitcoin anymore because of the scalability issue. You don't want to make round-trip user money, right? Because each one of them is going to take forever, and it's going to take forever to confirm. It's going to be very expensive in terms of fees. So while it's still technically possible on Bitcoin, it doesn't make a lot of economic sense to do that anymore. But we still have those technology, and they're actually, better than what we used to have on Bitcoin at the time.
And is this, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm not the most familiar with Bitcoin Cash, but is this something that came over from Bitcoin Cash, that capability?
Yes. Yeah. Like keep in mind that both Joy and myself, we were working on Bitcoin Cash before, and actually in my cases, I even like wrote the original software that did the fork and everything. So a lot of stuff come from there, yeah. And that technology, like it's not a consensus rule. The whole cash fusion stuff is not a consensus rule. It's like an application that is built on top of the chain. So it can work. Like technically, you could do cash fusion on BTC if you wanted to. That would work as well. It's just completely economically unreasonable to do so. But there is no like technical reason why it wouldn't work. It's completely economical. Any chain that is Bitcoin like that protocol can work on top of.
Right. So it's a good example of a trade-off, really, that Bitcoin took. It's always kind of advertised itself as like not making any development decisions and just like sticking to this main thing. But BTC made a big trade-off in privacy when they opted not to scale in the way that Bitcoin Cash did and the way that eCash has, because they basically deprecated technology like cash fusion on BTC. But it's a bit of a 2017 point, like it, and the BTC side of that would say like, well, who cares, right?
Yeah,
the market didn't want that, and it's like, well, you're right, but it depends what you're designing for and what you're engineering for, and ultimately, privacy is something that I think needs to be part of any successful cryptocurrency. And of course, it's a loaded question, right? Like, what does successful cryptocurrency mean? But if you look at, say, just like the last 1 or 2 years and the direction that the regulatory environment is going, it's basically anything that can't be tracked 100% to your name is going to be illegal. And we're not really there yet, but there's absolutely no moves away from that direction. Everything is just another click of the ratchet towards that direction. BTC is very well prepared for that regulatory environment. They've been doing everything, which is effectively nothing in terms of changing the development, but all of the decisions they've made have set them up really well to be, hey, like we're the de facto thing. We have the most history. We have the biggest data set that all of your models have been trained on. They've never been mixed. Everything is this type of transaction. Every exchange has a history of addresses. You can know who everybody is. And in fact, a lot of our business model is like Lightning Node and custodial services, who we actually have a list of our customers and their names and like their phones that everything's on. So BTC is very well prepared for that market environment. And I would argue that really they've made a lot of development decisions to embrace that market environment. In a similar way, I think Ethereum's also quite well prepared for that market environment, although I think that wasn't as deliberate of a move by Ethereum developers. I think they just wanted a lot of features that as a consequence made scaling more of a second layer solution in general. And then as a byproduct for their popularity, there's lots of addresses, a bunch of history, and it's very easy to tie addresses to people. But with BTC, I'd say it is more almost deliberately anti-private, which is weird because BTC kind of promotes itself as this like, we're privacy, we're sovereign, we do all these things. It's like, but you've been doing everything the opposite of that. And Ethereum has just sort of moved into that through their own scaling decisions, which had different goals.
I find it like particularly interesting. Like it's really fascinating because it's how we got the current financial system that we have, right? So imagine you're trading with like gold and whatever. 2,000 years ago, you're trading around the Mediterranean, in like the Roman Empire or whatever, with the Greek and the Egyptian and whatnot. And well, you got to transport your gold on your boat, and that's very inconvenient. That's also very dangerous, right? Because if there is an accident or whatever, your gold on the bottom of the sea, you can never recover it, right? So all of that is quite inconvenient. So what do people start to do? Well, they leave the gold in a vault with someone that is gonna keep the gold there, and that person issues like certificate that, hey, like this certificate is, can be redeemed for that much gold in my vault. And people start trading with those certificates instead of trading the gold itself. And, a few iteration of that, and you have the current financial system that we have. And it's really interesting and fascinating to me, but also a bit disappointing that BTC is taking that road, right? So they're like, okay, we're not gonna scale. So now you have all that problem to use Bitcoin in practice for exchanges. And what happens? Well, you have a set of intermediary that are gonna allow you to trade IOUs of Bitcoin instead of the Bitcoin themselves. So for instance, if you have a balance of an exchange, you effectively have IOUs from that exchange to receive Bitcoin upon request. If you are also using the Lightning Network, for instance, so there's a way to do that where you don't actually have the Bitcoin, but you're exchanging like messages on the Lightning Network that at any point you can settle for real Bitcoin. So all of that is like transforming trading Bitcoin into trading IOUs of Bitcoin, and it's really getting in the same direction, but with the same problem, right? Because the next problem that happens when you do that with gold in the vault and trading the IOUs is that you get a liquidity problem. At some point, you need an absurd amount of gold to make sure that everybody can withdraw the gold wherever they are. So what do you start doing? Well, you start emitting more certificate than you actually have gold, because that solves the liquidity problem. And what do you know? We see exchange doing that all the time now, right? Where they sell you coins that they don't have, and at some point they go bust. So in all of that, like I find it quite interesting and quite fascinating, because the same solution are being deployed to solve the same problem, just like with a technological twist, right? Instead of being gold in the vault, it's like a cryptographic entry in some ledger. But beside that, from a high level perspective, the same thing is happening right now. It's really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, it's like a speed run of the history.
Yeah, it's like a speed run of the old financial system.
They're like, let's do 3,000 years in 10 years. They're really like doing a great job.
Yeah.
It's
basically, what is the current plan to increase adoption in general and awareness of eCash as a project?
I'd say kind of the foundation of the plan is holding the developers accountable for price action. So the funding available to eCash is totally dependent on what the market price is of eCash. So effectively, if the price goes down, developers are bad at their jobs, which is difficult in the crypto bear market, especially for me, right? Like I'm a developer on eCash. Basically, my job is to make sure that the price of eCash does well, and it has not been doing well, in line with all of the other cryptocurrencies for the last 2-ish years. But that's still step one. It's accountability and incentives. So you have to make the people who are responsible for the project suffer consequences if they don't succeed in the missions, or at least what they've outlined for it. Step two from that, at least this is more kind of my personal opinion about it, we need to be really realistic about where we're at in the crypto market right now. I don't think like some player is just going to suddenly overtake BTC because they have something that might be technically better, but most people in the market really don't understand or can appreciate. Like you really have to be solving real world problems as they exist. And even if, like, I'd say this is maybe a bit of a jaded crypto thing for me, like I've been at 2013, and it's like we're going to take on the Fed and we're going to solve all these problems. If you have the perfect technical product that just existed right now, like if you imagine eCash had full scaling, 20x, everything was ready, all the bells and whistles. We even had a nice white paper that proved all of it and just launched it. Probably nothing would happen. It would probably just keep doing exactly the same thing that it's doing. So a lot of it is understanding the empirical reality of like what's going on in the crypto market, what's going on in world markets, what problem are we trying to solve, and how long do we need to be around and improve to solve that problem. So I see it as like a very empirical reality thing. To take that as a sort of an example, right? If you look at 2021, there were so many projects that came up and like they were the ETH killers. And so many of them got VC funding to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And basically all of them immediately set about just copying Uniswap. So you had bridges, you had other swap exchanges, you had stuff like you had Solana. And yeah, that's cool. And like that's what people wanted to do in 2020 and in 2021. But I don't think you're really having any sort of financial revolution there. Like I don't think you're solving these multi-millennia old problems. And the VCs who invested in those coins weren't trying to solve those problems either, right? They were trying to get a return on their investment. And they're going to be like, well, if we're putting in $100 million, we're going to get this bridge, we're going to get this. We want a percentage of this trading action. We want to see this token go from this to this. All very short-term goals. They still are on the hook for it, but they're not really on the hook for it in terms of the software quality is bad 5 years from when they made that decision. So eCash's empirical iterative approach to actually putting the funding into the protocol, I think inspires accountability, but also some long-term incentives. That said, it's still, yeah, it's a tricky problem.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point a minute ago too, that it does not really matter what you show or can prove that you have that as technically an improvement, even maybe a vast improvement.
It doesn't necessarily matter now. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, right? Like, if it really doesn't matter, then what are we doing? Why are we working on this stuff at all?
Yes,
right?
maybe that's
I think actually,
but it does not matter to people necessarily in the sense that they're not going to drop all their BTC and go instantly invest in something else.
Yeah. But I think it matters a lot because, so for the short-term price action, it doesn't apparently, right? Quite evidently, actually. But you also see that a lot of those stuff that shot very high, they don't stay around, right? Like if you look at all the cool projects that existed on that front, like just 5 years ago, 90+% of them are just dead now, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not building something sound, you can create hype for some time, right? And you can, put the price like quite high with that hype for a while, but eventually, you're not going to be around if you're not creating any actual value or certain hype. Like personally, what I'm seeing is that we have more and more third party that are abusing their position, and quite often they are being like forced into doing that by various government, but not always. Sometimes they do it by themselves, right? And like a few example would be the trucker protest in Canada, for instance, where funding was cut to them. Like WikiLeaks is another example, but like it's getting to milder stuff, because I saw the other day Trigonometry, which is a podcast, right, that discuss topics that are a bit controversial sometimes, but it's a podcast at the end of the day, right? And they got unplugged from their financial services because they were controversial. So that's happening more and more, and that's happening for less and less important stuff. So I think this is where we need to be ready, because as cash is disappearing, I think this is the key that people are missing. As cash is disappearing, those third parties, they start having total control over your money, right? What has kept technical intermediary that we use in the numeric space in check is the fact that if they screw it up, we're going to use cash instead. But we are using cash less and less. Now we go to the supermarket, we pay with a credit card, right? And online, we cannot even use cash with, like, it was never possible, right? So as more and more of the economy move online, and as more technological payment means are used in day-to-day life, cash is disappearing. And as cash is disappearing, then suddenly the intermediary have 100% of the control, and it has no alternative or competition to keep them in check. So we see more and more abuse on that front. And this is where we want to be there, for people that have problem with that.
Yeah.
Very much, right? Like,
Yeah,
we want to be there. And I think that actually those financial intermediary, they are doing a lot of the work for ourselves, right? Because the more they do that, and the more we can present the value of what we're doing.
And that
they're
is
basically
where
doing the marketing.
those obvious improvements actually do make a difference. I definitely did not mean to say that it does not make a difference at all, but more that from what I've seen in the past year or so that I've been in this space,
because
there is just a lack of
say the
understanding and
intermediaries
believing,
are
still a
blocking
lack
your
of
payment in some way, right? Say the intermediaries are blocking your payment. People are gonna tell you, a lot of people on the internet are gonna tell you, well, there's BTC for that, but there is not really, right? Because if suddenly a lot of people start using BTC, it's going to become completely unusable very quickly, and the fees are going to be sky high, and you're not going to pay like $20 fee to, like buy a cup of coffee or, buy some grocery or whatever. It just doesn't make sense, right? The economic of that doesn't work. Plus, like, what are you going to do with the confirmation time? If it takes several hours to confirm, are you going to like sit around the grocery store until your payment confirms? It just doesn't work, right? And people don't realize that because they are using intermediaries, right? There are like various intermediaries that do the payment for you and that handle all of that for you. But if you are using those intermediaries, you have the same problem than, the people that get excluding from their payment processor or their bank account or whatever. Like the same pressure can be put on your intermediary that is processing your BTC for you. So that's not solving that problem. In the case of BTCs, because they don't want to scale, as Joey mentioned, in the case of Ethereum, it's because the technology is actually very difficult to scale for, very technical reason. And I know for a fact, because I know like several Ethereum developers, that they put a lot of effort into solving those problems, but they are just very, very hard to solve in the Ethereum ecosystem. So this is why we're so much attached to the fact that it's scalable and very usable. It's because you have this very concrete problem that is like slowly creeping, and each year you have more of it than the previous year. And we see that as extremely dystopian, right? Because last century, what did we do with like the undesirable people? They were sent to like gulags or concentration camp or whatever. Like there was a lot of government killing their own people, but that's not going to happen this century because they don't need to. They can unplug you from the financial system. And what do you know? You cannot buy food, you cannot pay your rent, right? So suddenly you're homeless and forced to beg for food, and you're never going to amount to anything in life. It's such a dystopian possibility that we have in front of us. And for a fact that some government are going to do it. It's hard to know which one, right? But they are all moving kind of in that direction. So we are far from that
they're all
scenario, right? I don't want to,
It's
but we are moving there, right? Like all the Western government and many of non-Western government as well are moving in that direction. And some of them are going to go too far. That's a guarantee. And we want to make sure that when that happens, we have something for the people to who that's happening.
Yeah, like in one sense, it's good that most people aren't financial dissidents at the moment, right? Like that's one of the reasons that if we launch this theoretically perfect be your own bank monetary sovereignty coin, most people wouldn't care. Like most people just don't actually value that, and that's fine. But the people who do care are the people who are running into the problems and the walls thrown up by current financial regulations or political influences, what have you, right? And that supply of people is getting bigger every year, probably exponentially. I'd say it doesn't look like very much now, because right now you're like, oh, well, obviously these people are running into problems. They have the wrong political opinions. I don't have the wrong political opinions, so I'm going to be fine. But it doesn't take much for that to change. And I'd say that more people are, getting canceled, if you will, now than they were last year, or than they were the year before, or the year before that. So it's a bit of an arms race. We want to make sure that the technology is ready for larger numbers of people as those impositions continue to grow. I'd say right now, in many ways, the technology is already ready. Like if you really want to just live your life totally outside of the banking system by using crypto, you can do that. I don't recommend most people do that. I don't recommend normal people do that at the moment. But the technology is already available right now. It's
If I
just
can
that
interject,
uh,
I did that for like I'm not doing that right now, but I've stopped for like 2 years, and before that I did that for like 5 years, where I was living on crypto. I know that some people like Joel Valenzuela, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but I know he's been doing it for years as well. Like it's something that you can do now. But if you ask to any of those people, they're gonna confirm what I'm telling you. You cannot do that on BTC or on Ethereum. Like it's just it doesn't work. You can do that with eCash, obviously. You can do that with BCH and Dash and a few others, but BTC and Ethereum, it just don't work for that kind of use case.
they're not designed for financial dissidents, and like that's not their market. That's not what they're trying to capture. And we'll have to see where it goes.
Definitely. Were there any topics that you wanted to make sure and throw out there just before we do wrap up? So I'm not cutting off anything that you really wanted to bring up.
Well, I'd say an extension of that, like if you look at the regulatory environment and you look at where things are going, like I said earlier, most people are not financial dissidents, but more and more people kind of find themselves in that category every year. Not necessarily because there's suddenly a growing popularity in financial crime. I think that that's always been a bit of a baseline in humanity, but the scope and definition of what constitutes financial crime is getting a lot more restrictive and a lot larger every year. And that sort of ties in as well, I'd say, with the importance of open source software. So a lot of those, so-called ETH killers, a lot of their apps and basically ETH copying stuff was not open source, and you can still sort of build a business on that and try to reach a short-term goal on that. But I don't think you can ever actually have an auditable, cryptographically secure system on that. The other thing about open source software and cryptocurrency is that you're effectively building a financial product that is increasingly regarded as risky, if not outright illegal, depending on your jurisdiction. So that's why we talked earlier about privacy and the importance of privacy. If you have the combination of privacy and open source software and cryptocurrency, I think that's sort of the way forward for individual freedom in terms of living in any sort of financial system, economic system, technological system. And eCash, in addition to being a cryptocurrency, I'd say it's an empirical model for that, right? It's open source, it's revenue generating, and it's trying to solve these monetary sovereign problems. I'd say in the future, some difficult things that will come up for teams like eCash and say other cryptocurrency teams as well, is it will probably be de facto illegal, if not outright like on the books illegal, to even work on things like this. So we're always trying to keep our eyes out for like what are the next kind of risks and threats and problems that need to be solved. And one of the solutions for that is trying to make the money technology as good as possible before you start having bigger social problems in the engineering of the money.
And that's actually a really great aspect of the project to bring up, the open sourcing. Do you feel like you run into any challenges making this all happen from an open source angle, outlook on everything?
The senior dev who does all my code reviews is like way meaner about it because everything's got to be in the repo and everybody can see what's happening. So like you have to really make sure stuff doesn't get hacked, right? Like when I was just developing and before I got into crypto stuff, and even like some of my individual projects, you think more and you worry more about bugs, but if you're making something open source like that has a step change in terms of the quality you need, like the entire internet can see that, the entire internet can attack it. That also gives you a step change in the quality you get, because if something is open source for years at a time, it's been subject to these threats for years at a time. So you have that empirical confidence as well. And then on top of that, we're not just an open source repo that people depend on. It's an open source repo that's financial that people depend on, right? So if I'm developing a wallet, a web wallet called CashTab, and you have to make sure that like you don't have bugs in the sense that you don't want weird pop-ups or like flash of unstyled content or the usual kind of web developer problems. But you also have to make sure that there's not a way that people can steal money, right? And one of the best ways to do that is to actually make it open source, because as soon as it's open source, then you're like, oh shit, somebody's going to see this. It better, it better actually like pass these tests, and it better like do it in an elegant way, because otherwise, not just like somebody could steal the money, or like not just like, oh, I'm going to look like a bad developer, but somebody might actually have some financial problem. So
Of
it's
course, it
one of
holds
the
you accountable a little bit more.
yeah, it certainly does. And
yeah, that's not always the case, but on average, in my experience, working on both open source and closed source, I'd say on average the quality of the software on open source is actually higher. And there are several reasons, but yeah, the fact that people are gonna see how the sausage is made, forces you to have a clean kitchen in that sense, right? There are other social reasons, because there are people that come and go on open source projects. So you want to make sure that if they contribute something, it's not going to be a maintenance nightmare for everybody involved later on. Whereas the company can throw people at that problem.
Right.
So there are various reasons, but yeah, in general, the open source software, people are pushed toward doing something that is more qualitative.
All right. Well, with that, how can you, both of you, by the way, be followed, reached online potentially? Any socials you want to shout out, or groups?
Telegram's probably the best. I'm at Bytes of Man, BYTESOFMAN. I have a Twitter account that I'm trying to be less addicted to, but I almost never say anything there, so it's.
And can I ask what the name is inspired by, just out of curiosity?
Oh man, like you think of these screen names, and it always, you're like, yeah, it's great, and then just like a decade goes by and you still have it, and you're like, oh, it's all right. Like now I can't change it. So there it is. But it was 20. I think I came up with that in 2013, and it sounded kind of like the American independence movement writings, Thomas Paine stuff. And I was like, yeah, but now it's digital. So basically a reflection of what I think is sort of the current iteration of a very old arms race in terms of individual sovereignty versus state control.
I'm glad I asked now. And Amaury?
Yeah, so if you want to learn about the project, e.cash is probably the starting point. There are a lot of explanation about how things work, and explorers and various tools where to download wallets and all of that, like all the practical information that you might want. E.cash. If you want to see a bit more the software development side of things, bitcoinabc.org is where we're going to do that. We have various development tools there, and if you want to participate to the development also, it's open source, so you can, and you're gonna find all the information necessary there. Otherwise, for me personally, it's gonna be DDLNix, DADLNIX, pretty much everywhere, like Twitter, GitHub, I don't know, even LinkedIn if you want. I'm gonna have this, like if you see this handle somewhere, it's almost certainly me, and otherwise someone tried to impersonate me.
All right, well, sounds good. Thank you so much for spending about an hour here now, I guess. There was a lot of information being thrown around here, so I hope this was easy enough to follow anyway. But I really appreciate both of you guys' time, and I realize it's kind of hard to coordinate this. It was a bit of a challenge, but thank you for being here. I hope it's not getting too late anyway.
No, it's okay, and thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Well, we will go ahead and sign off here. Thank you so much for anyone viewing this episode. I know it's kind of a long one, but there was a lot to get out there, and hopefully you're just a little bit more familiar with eCash now. And of course, eCash is the newest asset that is now integrated into StackWallet. So you can always move your eCash over if you feel like it. Check us out. And follow Amaury and Joey if you're interested in learning a little bit more and hearing their thoughts.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.